In 1806, one family simultaneously held the debt of 5 warring European nations. Nobody called it what it was. They called it banking. They were wrong. If you're new here, subscribe. We cover history's greatest power plays like nobody else does. Now, Frankfurt, 1760. The alley had a name, Judengasse, Jew Lane. It was not a neighborhood, it was a cage. Frankfurt City Council had designed it precisely and deliberately, a single street, barely wide enough for 2 men to walk abreast without brushing shoulders, locked at both ends by iron gates that swung shut at sundown and stayed shut on Sundays, on Christian feast days, and on the days when the city council simply decided it preferred not to see its Jewish residents moving through the public streets. The gates opened in the morning with a sound of iron on iron that every child on the lane knew before they could read. They closed at night with the same sound, final, mechanical, indifferent. For centuries before this story begins, those two sounds had bookended every day lived on Judengasse. The residents were counted at the gate each morning. Not welcomed, counted. The city allowed a fixed number of Jewish families to reside in Frankfurt, and that number was managed the way a property manager manages a storage unit. There was a maximum occupancy. There were fees. There were periodic reviews. The residents of Judengasse could not own land outside the lane. They could not practice most trades that would bring them into sustained commercial contact with Christians. They were not permitted to walk in certain parks, cross certain bridges, enter certain buildings, or remain on the main streets after dark. The legal architecture of their exclusion had been constructed over generations with a craftsman's attention to completeness. Every door that might lead to wealth, to influence, to the kind of financial independence that translated into political power, every one of those doors had been found and locked. In summer, the Judengasse was something a person never forgot. Thousands of bodies packed into a space designed for hundreds, no functioning drainage, no ventilation worth the name, the walls of the buildings so close overhead that in the narrowest sections the upper stories nearly touched. The smell of bodies, of cooking, of animals, of waste that had nowhere efficient to go, was simply the smell of the lane, and the children who grew up there stopped noticing it the same way children everywhere stopped noticing the smell of their own homes. What they noticed instead were the gates. And what a certain kind of child, growing up on Judengasse, eventually learned to notice was the rhythm of the gates, which days they opened, how long they stayed open, what moved through them and what didn't, and what the gate's existence implied about the world on the other side. Mayor Amschel Bauer was that kind of child. His father, Moses Amschel Bauer, ran a small currency exchange and antique coin shop on the lane. The sign above the door was a red shield, Rothschild in German. The shop was modest. The trade was real but limited, constrained by the same framework that constrained everything on Judengasse. Moses understood his world with the clarity that comes from having no illusions about it. He was good at his work. He was respected within the community. He was, within the available terms, successful. When Moses died young, Meir was 11 years old enough to understand what had been lost, young enough that the loss still had time to shape what he would become. He was sent to Hanover to apprentice at a banking firm. Not a grand banking house, a legitimate but modest operation that needed young hands willing to learn currency exchange, to memorize the values of dozens of different coinage systems from dozens of different principalities, to understand how money moved across the fragmented political landscape of 18th-century German states. Meir slept in a storage room. He ate whatever was available at the end of the day. He learned the languages of money in the way that only someone with nothing else to fall back on truly learns them, not as theory, but as survival. What he saw during those apprentice years was something that no textbook on banking had yet articulated as a principle: the asymmetry of information. The people who needed to move money across borders, merchants, aristocrats, government treasurers, military commanders, were almost never the same people who understood the mechanics of doing it efficiently. There was a gap between the people who had power and the people who understood money, and that gap was exploitable, not through fraud, through service, through making yourself the person who closed the gap, who translated between the language of power and the language of capital, who moved money faster and more reliably and more discreetly than any alternative. The person who occupied that position was not merely useful. The person who occupied that position was indispensable. And indispensable was the only form of untouchable available to a young man from Judengasse. By his mid-twenties, Mayer had returned to Frankfurt and taken over his father's shop. He had also adopted his father's sign. From this point forward, he was no longer Bauer. He was Rothschild, the Red Shield. It was the first rebranding of what would become the most powerful private financial institution in history, and he chose it deliberately, because the Red Shield was visible above the street, distinctive against the crowded facades of Judengasse, something a wealthy client could spot and remember and find again. Even the name was strategy. His first acquisition was not money, it was access. Mayer had developed during his years of study an obsessive expertise in rare and antique coins, and he had done his research carefully enough to know that one specific man in the region shared that obsession: Crown Prince Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel. Wilhelm was not yet a ruler, but he was heir to one of the largest private fortunes in Europe, because the Hesse-Kassel family had spent several decades running a highly profitable sideline business, renting their subjects as soldiers to foreign powers. The Hessian mercenaries who crossed the Atlantic to fight for the British crown during the American Revolutionary War were not volunteers. They were a revenue stream. Wilhelm's father had negotiated the contracts, organized the logistics, and invested the proceeds with considerable shrewdness. And Wilhelm was about to inherit a financial portfolio that would make most European monarchs envious. Mayer began sending Wilhelm coins, not selling, sending, with careful, handwritten notes describing their provenance, their historical significance, their rarity, their condition, the specific reasons why each coin was interesting to someone with Wilhelm's level of numismatic sophistication. He was not asking for payment. He was not requesting business. He was demonstrating value. He was establishing himself, methodically and patiently, as the most knowledgeable coin specialist in Wilhelm's orbit. He was building a relationship in the only currency that ultimately mattered more than gold: trust combined with indispensability. The coins were an audition. They were also, in their way, a map of how Mayer's mind worked. Everything had a function beyond its obvious function. Every transaction contained within it a second transaction that was doing the real work. When Wilhelm finally agreed to meet, Mayer arrived with precision. He knew which coins Wilhelm did not yet possess. He knew which ones would feel like genuine discoveries to a collector of Wilhelm's depth. He knew exactly what price would register as generosity while remaining profitable. He knew when to stop talking, which is, in sales as in diplomacy, the skill that separates competent practitioners from masters. The meeting produced a small contract, a few coin purchases. Some currency exchange work at rates that were fair but not extraordinary. But Mayer had secured something that no gate, no Judengasse law, no city council edict had been able to touch: a client inside the aristocracy, a relationship that existed on his terms, a door that the system had designed to be locked, which he had found a way to open, not by breaking it, but by making himself the person the man on the other side wanted to let in. Here is the operating system that Mayer Amschel Rothschild was building, and it needs to be stated clearly because everything that follows is a direct consequence of it. He had identified a structural flaw in how European power actually operated, a flaw so fundamental and so persistent that it had survived centuries of political change without anyone in power ever fully understanding it. Power in 18th century Europe claimed to live in crowns and armies and city councils and aristocratic lineage. The people who held those symbols of power sincerely believed they were the engine of the world. But power actually lived in liquidity, in the ability to move capital across borders faster than your enemies could respond, in the ability to be the person who financed both sides of a conflict while neither side realized you were doing it. In the ability to make yourself essential, not to any single ruler, but to the mechanism of rulership itself, so that the rules, over time, slowly bent around you rather than constraining you. The aristocracy of Europe did not understand this because they didn't need to. They had inherited their positions. They had armies. They had territory. They had the backing of centuries of tradition and religious authority. What they intermittently ran out of, with a frequency that should have been embarrassing but wasn't, was cash. Governments needed money to fight wars. Wars were expensive beyond any peacetime revenue system's ability to fund. Every major European conflict of the 17th and 18th centuries had been financed, at some point, by private lenders operating at the margin of official systems, because official systems were too slow, too transparent, too constrained by political allegiances to do what needed doing when it needed doing. The person who could provide capital quickly, discreetly, reliably, across borders and political affiliations, that person was not merely useful. That person was the hidden, load-bearing wall of European civilization. And that person, if they were Jewish, if they lived on a locked lane, if they existed outside the official structures of aristocratic society, that person was also uniquely positioned. Because existing outside the official structure meant they could serve multiple parties without the formal allegiances that would otherwise make such service treasonous. The outsider status that the Judengas had been designed to impose as a punishment was, in Mayer's hands, an operational advantage. He was not bound by the loyalties that bound everyone else. He could move. He had 5 sons: Amschel, Salomon, Nathan, Karl, and James. And he understood something about inheritance that most wealthy men of his era did not. Inheritance divided power. The standard model of succession: father dies, estate divided among heirs, each heir goes their separate way, was a mechanism for destroying dynasties within 2 or 3 generations. Mayer had watched it happen to merchant families on Judengas and to aristocratic houses across Europe. The wealth dispersed, the family fragmented, the coordination evaporated, the leverage collapsed. He had spent his entire adult life building something that required coordination to function. He was not going to hand that something to 5 sons and watch it become 5 smaller, weaker things. He was building a corporation. In a corporation, each division serves the parent structure. Each son would not be given a piece of the business to run independently. Each son would be deployed deliberately, strategically, to a location where the Rothschild network needed a node. Each son would build local relationships, cultivate local influence, manage local finances. Each son would also maintain, through a combination of regular correspondence, shared cipher, coordinated strategy, and family obligation, his role as a functioning component of the larger organism. The network was the asset. The network's value exceeded the sum of its parts, but only if the parts never stopped working in coordination. The intelligence infrastructure was the critical piece that made this work. In an era when news traveled at the speed of a horse, when information about a battle outcome or a currency collapse or a sovereign's financial distress might take days or weeks to move from its origin to the people who needed to act on it, a family with coordinated agents in 5 major European financial capitals had something no government, no army, no other private institution possessed: the functional equivalent of a real-time intelligence network. They would know the outcome of battles before official couriers arrived. They would know which currencies were about to break before the treasury ministers had finished counting the damage. They would know which monarchs were privately desperate before those monarchs had admitted it to their own advisors. They would move on that knowledge with precision and speed, making financial decisions in the gap between when they knew something and when everyone else knew it. That gap was where all the money was. Mayer formalized the architecture in his will, which he completed in 1812, and which contained provisions so specific about how the family business was to operate that historians who later read it came away convinced they were looking at the constitutional documents of a small state rather than the testamentary instructions of a merchant. The sons were to cooperate absolutely. The business was to remain a family partnership. And the sons and their sons after them were to marry within the family, cousins to cousins. The capital was never to leave the network. The secrets were never to leave the network. He had spent 40 years building something that could be destroyed by a single disloyal marriage, a single heir who shared confidential information with an in-law, a single outsider who gained enough visibility into the firm's operations to replicate or undermine them. He was closing the loop. The crisis that clarified all of this, that turned a general strategy into an urgent imperative, came from Napoleon Bonaparte. By 1806, the French emperor had reorganized the map of Europe so aggressively and so rapidly that the old power structures were dissolving in real time. The Holy Roman Empire ceased to exist. The German states were being reorganized into French client states. Frankfurt itself was under French influence. The Jewish community of Judengasse found its legal restrictions easing, not because Europe had suddenly become enlightened, but because Napoleon's administrative reforms were sweeping away the medieval city-state laws that had encoded those restrictions, replacing them with a more rationalized legal system that had less room for the specific, local degradations of Judengasse. The gates were opening. The legal framework of Mayer's childhood was dissolving. And Mayer, standing in his counting house at the age of 62, with the Napoleonic reshaping of the continent thundering around him, armies moving, currencies collapsing, governments dissolving, borders evaporating, understood something that every other merchant and banker in Frankfurt was too frightened to see. The chaos was not the threat. The chaos was the market. The people who would survive this were not the ones who protected themselves most effectively. The people who would survive, and more than survive, who would emerge from the other side of the reorganization in a position of dominant structural power, were the ones who stayed liquid, stayed operational, stayed coordinated, and positioned themselves to be the financial mechanism through which the new Europe rebuilt itself on the other side of the war. He did not see danger. He saw inventory. He already knew which firm that would be. He did not yet have all 5 sons deployed, but he already knew exactly what each one would do. And the man watching from the corner of European finance, watching the Rothschilds begin to move through the chaos with a precision that didn't make sense unless you understood that they were operating as a single coordinated entity rather than 5 separate businesses, was about to realize, too late, that there was no counterplay available once the network was fully operational. The deployment happened with the precision of a military campaign mapped out in advance. Amschel, the eldest, remained in Frankfurt to manage what was in every sense the founding base of operations. His role was continuity, stability, the maintenance of the relationships that Mayer had spent 40 years building, above all, the relationship with Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel, which by this point had evolved so far beyond coin trading that the original transaction would have seemed almost quaint by comparison. Wilhelm, now Elector Wilhelm I, had been forced to flee when Napoleon's troops moved through Hesse-Kassel in 1806. He fled with such urgency, with so little time to organize his finances, that he left behind a substantial portion of his liquid assets. Estimates suggest something in the range of 3 million thaler, an extraordinary sum, in the custody of Mayer Amschel Rothschild. This was not a casual arrangement. This was Wilhelm trusting the most important financial asset he possessed to a man who lived on a street that technically no longer had legal gates, but whose community still had no legal right to the protections that would have made such a trust routine and official. It was a relationship built entirely on demonstrated reliability over decades. And what happened next was the single most important proof of concept in the Rothschild Corporation's early history. French troops occupied Frankfurt. French administrators searched for hidden aristocratic assets. The Rothschilds concealed Wilhelm's fortune with a craftsman's attention to detail, portions of it hidden physically, in locations that French investigators would not think to check and could not legally compel disclosure of even if they suspected the right direction. Portions of it deployed carefully, generating returns while remaining off any official ledger. Amschel paid Wilhelm his agreed returns on schedule, through the occupation, through the chaos, through every disruption that would have justified a lesser custodian declaring force majeure and walking away. When Wilhelm returned after Napoleon's defeat, his fortune was intact, and Wilhelm was not merely grateful. He was permanently, functionally, deeply obligated in a way that transformed every future relationship they would have. The Rothschilds had held a royal fortune through a war and returned it undamaged. No aristocrat in Europe could ignore what that meant. The Hesse-Kassel connection became a credential, a reference letter written in gold, that opened every door in European aristocratic finance. The son who held Frankfurt had held the foundational leverage. Salomon deployed to Vienna. This was the most politically complex territory in Europe, the seat of the Habsburg Empire, the nerve center of the concert of Europe that would emerge from the Congress of Vienna in 1815, the home of Prince Clemens von Metternich, the most powerful statesman on the continent and a man whose worldview was built on a contempt for the commercial classes that was so refined it had become almost philosophical. Metternich believed in hierarchy, in tradition, in the divine right of aristocratic order. He had no ideological reason to deal with a Jewish banker from Frankfurt. He had one very practical reason. The Habsburg Empire's finances were in a state that would have embarrassed most medieval kingdoms. The wars against Napoleon had cost Austria staggeringly. The treasury was not merely depleted. It was structurally compromised, running deficits that could not be closed through normal revenue mechanisms, without a degree of fiscal reform that the Habsburg political class was constitutionally incapable of implementing. Salomon's entry into Vienna was therefore not a social conquest. It was a financial necessity dressed in the language of service. He established himself as the Austrian government's primary bond underwriter, the firm that could place Austrian sovereign debt with European investors at competitive rates, generating the liquidity the empire needed to function while building, bond by bond, a dependency that was the mirror image of the dependency Amschel had built with Wilhelm. He negotiated the right to establish a formal bank in Vienna, a right that had previously been denied to Jews. He purchased one of the palaces that Vienna's aristocrats rented out when they needed cash. He entertained. He became, through the patient application of financial indispensability, a fixture of Viennese high society, a fixture that Metternich found it more useful to accommodate than to exclude. But here is what no one tells you about Salomon in Vienna. His real weapon was not the money he lent to Austria. It was the information he gathered from being inside Austria's financial machinery. Every government secret has a financial dimension. Wars have price tags. Treaties involve payments. Diplomatic negotiations leave paper trails in treasury ledgers. Salomon was sitting at the intersection of Austrian state finance and Rothschild intelligence operations, and every significant thing he learned about Habsburg policy, about military planning, about diplomatic intentions, moved by private Rothschild courier to his brothers in London, Paris, Naples, and Frankfurt within days. The network was not merely a banking network. It was the most sophisticated private intelligence operation in Europe, and the banking was its cover, and its revenue streamed simultaneously. Nathan had gone to England. This turned out to be the masterstroke that none of them had fully anticipated, because England was about to become the center of global finance in a way that would have seemed speculative from the perspective of 1798 Frankfurt. The Industrial Revolution was accelerating. British manufacturing was beginning its dominance of global production. The British Empire was expanding in India and beginning to reorganize the trade flows of the entire planet. London was not yet the undisputed capital of global capital. That position was still contested, but the trajectory was visible to anyone who looked at where the money was going. Nathan arrived first in Manchester, working in the textile trade, learning how English commerce operated from the inside out. He was doing what every Rothschild did in a new territory, building a map of how things worked before attempting to insert himself into the mechanism. Then he moved to London. He established himself on the Royal Exchange. He found his spot near a particular pillar that became so associated with him that it would later be called Nathan's Pillar, and he operated from it with the physical presence and financial aggression that made him, in the accounts of those who observed him, genuinely intimidating. He was larger than his brothers, louder, more direct, more willing to take a position and hold it through the discomfort of the market moving against him temporarily. He moved large sums with a speed that other firms simply couldn't match, because he had something they didn't: letters arriving from the continent, carried by private Rothschild couriers who were faster and more reliable than any government post, telling him things about European markets and political situations that no one in London yet knew. He traded on that knowledge. He made money on that knowledge. And then he found the opportunity that transformed a successful private bank into something of a different order entirely. He became the primary financial intermediary for the British government's war effort against Napoleon. The subsidies that Britain paid to its continental allies, the payments that kept Prussia and Austria and the smaller coalition states in the field, moved through Nathan Mayer Rothschild. The sheer volume of those transactions, and the logistical complexity of moving specie across a war-disrupted continent at speed and with reliability, was something that only a firm with the Rothschild network's coordination capacity could execute. Nathan became, within 2 decades of arriving in England with little but his father's training and his own nerve, the single most powerful private financier in the world. He was also, by this point, something more than a banker. He was the mechanism through which British power projected itself financially onto the continent. He was, functionally, the Bank of England's most important outside contractor. The moment that crystallized the network's decisive advantage came at Waterloo. The mythology has been embellished to the point where separating fact from enhancement requires careful work, but the structure of what happened is documented and real. The Rothschild courier network relayed news of Napoleon's defeat to Nathan in London before any official British communication arrived. Nathan knew. He was at the exchange when he knew. What he chose to do with that knowledge, the specific trades he made in the hours between when he knew and when the market knew, produced a profit that contemporary observers found almost incomprehensible, and which later generations would argue over endlessly. The myth says he first sold heavily to create a market panic, then bought massively at the bottom. The reality was likely more nuanced and more complex. But the underlying fact was undeniable. The information advantage was real. It was structural. It was the product of a deliberate investment in communication infrastructure that no competitor had thought to make. It wasn't luck. It was architecture, and the architecture paid. Karl had been deployed to Naples, the financial capital of the Bourbon Kingdom of the Two Sicilies, and a territory whose strategic importance was less immediately obvious than London or Vienna, but whose geographical position, at the center of Mediterranean trade flows, at the hinge point between northern European finance and the markets of the Ottoman Empire and North Africa, made it a node that the network needed. Karl built the Naples house with a quieter hand than Nathan's, but with the same methodical competence. He established relationships with the Bourbon court and the local aristocracy. He financed the Neapolitan government's debt. He connected the Mediterranean node to the broader network. And James established the Paris house. This was in many ways the most culturally complex deployment. Paris was not only the financial center of France, but the cultural capital of European aristocratic life, a city where being accepted required navigating layers of social convention that made Vienna look straightforward. James managed it through a combination of financial indispensability and deliberate cultivation of relationships across the political spectrum. He would need to be useful to whatever government France had, and France, in the decades after Napoleon, went through governments with a frequency that made long-term relationship building particularly demanding. James built the Paris house into the most socially prominent of the five, entertaining artists and politicians and diplomats in a style that made the Rothschild name synonymous in Paris, not merely with finance, but with a certain kind of cultivation, a certain kind of power that expressed itself through culture rather than only through capital. 5 sons, 5 capitals, 1 corporation. The network was operational. But here is what no one tells you about the moment the network became fully operational. It had already begun building the mechanism of its own eventual undoing. And the mechanism was the same as the mechanism of its strength. The first major crisis came not from an enemy but from success itself. The victory over Napoleon and the Congress of Vienna that followed in 1815 reorganized Europe into a relatively stable conservative order. The Concert of Europe, managed by Metternich and the great powers, designed explicitly to prevent the kind of revolutionary upheaval that had produced Napoleon. The Rothschilds had financed the war that produced this outcome. They now financed the peace. Every major sovereign bond issuance in Europe in the 1820s and 1830s passed through one of the 5 houses. They financed the French government's payment of war reparations. They financed Austrian infrastructure. They financed the emerging rail networks. They financed the liberation movements of Latin American nations simultaneously with loans to the European powers those nations were separating from. A feat of simultaneous service to ostensibly opposed parties that was either cynical or philosophically neutral, depending on your view of what banking was for. The marriage strategy entered its operational phase in this period. Mayer had planted the requirement in his will. The first generation of sons honored it with remarkable discipline, not because they had no alternatives but because they understood what they were protecting. James married his niece Betty, Salomon's daughter. Anselm, Amschel's nephew, married Charlotte, Nathan's daughter. The marriages were not advertised. They were quietly documented, celebrated within the family, noted by outside observers who found them strange but did not yet understand their function. From the inside, the logic was clear. Every marriage outside the family was a potential leak. Every in-law was a person with their own loyalties, their own family, their own legal jurisdiction, their own potential claims on information or assets. The marriage strategy was a firewall. It kept the operating system proprietary. What it also did, what no one inside the family fully appreciated in the first generation, because the first generation had been shaped by Mayer's mind and Mayer's discipline, was remove the mechanism by which genetic and intellectual diversity would normally refresh a family enterprise. The aristocratic families of Europe who intermarried over generations produced the visible consequences: hemophilia in the Habsburgs, the curious clustering of certain traits in certain lines, the gradual narrowing of a gene pool not designed for closed circulation. The Rothschilds were not immune to this, but the genetic dimension was less immediately consequential than the intellectual one. Mayer had 5 sons who had been selected by the harshest possible process, the absolute necessity of excellence under conditions of legal exclusion. They had to be exceptional because mediocrity in their position simply meant failure. There was no fallback, no inherited title to soften the landing, no social position to maintain regardless of competence. Excellence was survival, but their children were born into wealth. Their grandchildren were born into dynasty. And as the generations advanced and the cousin marriages continued, the selection pressure that had produced the founding generation progressively weakened. This was not a moral failure. It was mathematics, and its consequences would not be visible until the world outside the corporation began changing faster than the corporation could adapt. The net was tightening in ways the family could not yet feel. The cousin marriages were locking in. The network was at its maximum coordination, and a specific person in a specific room was about to have the conversation that would show exactly how far the power had traveled from a locked lane in Frankfurt. It was 1875. The British government needed to move with a speed that its own institutional mechanisms were not designed to enable. The Khedive of Egypt, Ismail Pasha, deeply overborrowed and desperate for immediate cash to fund domestic projects and service existing debts, was offering to sell his personal share in the Suez Canal Company. Those shares represented roughly 44% of the canal's ownership. The canal itself was the most strategically important waterway on the planet at that moment, the artery through which British trade with India flowed, through which British military power could be projected into the Indian Ocean, through which the logic of the entire British imperial enterprise in Asia was sustained. Without the canal, the route to India added weeks and thousands of miles. With it, the empire was coherent. Without it, the empire was fragile in ways the Victorian strategic imagination did not want to contemplate. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli wanted those shares. He wanted them immediately before the French, who were watching the same opportunity, could act. He needed £4 million. Parliament was not in session. There was no mechanism through which the British government could access that sum through official treasury channels in the available time. The Bank of England had the theoretical capacity, but not the political authorization to move that quickly on a sovereign's behalf without parliamentary approval. Disraeli sent an aide to New Court, the London headquarters of N.M. Rothschild and Sons, situated in St. Swithin's Lane. The aide was shown in without undue delay. The Rothschilds were not a firm that kept the Prime Minister's office waiting. He was brought to Lionel de Rothschild, Nathan's son, who had by this point been managing the London house for decades, and had developed his father's facility with large numbers and his father's nerve without his father's physical theatricality. The aide explained the situation. Lionel listened. He reached across the desk to the bowl that sat there permanently, a bowl of muscatel grapes, a detail so specific and so consistent across multiple surviving accounts that it appears to have been genuinely characteristic, and he picked one up and ate it. He thought for a moment. Then he named his terms. The British government's credit would serve as collateral. The loan would be £4 million. The interest rate would be 3%. The funds would be available within 24 hours. The aide asked what security beyond the government's credit would be required. Lionel looked at him. The British government, he said, was sufficient security. Within 24 hours the money was available. Within a week, the Khedive's shares had been purchased. The Suez Canal became, effectively, a British strategic asset. The geopolitics of the following 80 years, British dominance of the Eastern Mediterranean and the routes to India, the centrality of Egypt in imperial strategy, the eventual crisis when Nasser nationalized the canal in 1956, and the British discovered that a world in which they could no longer simply act unilaterally had arrived while they weren't watching. All of it traced back in a direct, unbroken line to a room at New Court, a bowl of grapes, and a family that had traveled from a locked lane in Frankfurt to the position of being the only institution on earth capable of underwriting British imperial strategy on 24 hours' notice. This was the peak. This was the moment the Rothschild Corporation exceeded every state around it, not in military power, not in territory, in leverage, the only form of power that in the end all the others were ultimately for. And they had no idea the trap was already closing. But here is what no one tells you about the mechanism of their fall. It was not external. It was not an enemy they had failed to neutralize or a rival they had underestimated. The trap had been built by Mayer himself in 1812 with the best intentions available to a man who had spent his life watching what happened to families that couldn't hold together. The marriage strategy that had protected the network was now progressively isolating it, and the isolation was not only genetic. It was structural, cognitive, and institutional. The world the Rothschild network had been designed to serve was the world of aristocratic private finance, a world in which a relatively small number of states, managed by relatively small ruling classes, required the services of a relatively small number of sophisticated financial intermediaries to function. A world in which information traveled slowly enough that a private intelligence network was genuinely decisive. A world in which the relevant relationships were between individual powerful men who could make binding commitments, men like Metternich, like Wilhelm of Hesse-Kassel, like Disraeli, rather than between institutions and democratic publics. The Rothschild operating system had been calibrated with extraordinary precision for that world. It ran beautifully in that world. It was the dominant player in that world for the better part of a century. That world was ending. The telegraph had arrived by mid-century. The financial press had arrived. Public stock markets were expanding to a scale where private intelligence networks couldn't move them. The aggregate decision-making of millions of participants in public markets was not susceptible to the same kind of arbitrage that had made Waterloo possible. Central banks with government backing were being established across Europe, taking over functions that private Oat Bank had previously monopolized. The German unification of 1871 created a new major power, whose financial organization was built on different principles than the aristocratic private finance the Rothschilds had been born to serve. The United States was generating industrial fortunes of a scale that made even the accumulated Rothschild position look modest. J.P. Morgan, the Rockefellers, the steel and railroad and oil dynasties of the Gilded Age operated in a financial world so large and liquid and institutionally organized that no family network, however well coordinated, could dominate it the way the Rothschilds had dominated European high finance in the 1820s and 1830s. The family needed to adapt. Adaptation required outside blood, new perspectives, new risk appetites, new relationships with institutions and power structures that the existing family had not yet penetrated. Adaptation required exactly what the marriage strategy had been designed to prevent. The security architecture and the evolutionary mechanism were in direct conflict, and the security architecture had been written into the will. The family's political environment was also shifting in ways that compounded every structural vulnerability. Nationalism, the ideology that the concert of Europe had been designed to contain, that the Rothschilds' financing of that order had helped to suppress, was rising. Nationalism was incompatible with the Rothschild model in a fundamental way. The family's power derived precisely from operating across national boundaries, from serving multiple states simultaneously, from having no fixed national allegiance that would constrain their financial relationships. In a world of competing nationalisms, that cosmopolitanism was no longer merely suspicious. It was, in the eyes of the nationalist movements gaining strength across Europe, actively threatening. The family that had made itself essential to the aristocratic international order became a symbol, in the emerging mythology of nationalist politics, of the international order itself, with all the resentments that order had accumulated. The antisemitism that had always been present in European culture, but had been, under the aristocratic order, constrained to certain legal and social forms, found in the late 19th century a new political vocabulary and a new public platform. The Rothschilds, the most visible Jewish financial family in the world, became a focal point for that new anti-Semitic politics in ways that had nothing to do with what the family had actually done and everything to do with what they had become as a symbol. They were too big, too visible, too successful, and too identifiably Jewish in a political moment when those three things together made a target. The pamphlets came first, then the newspapers, then the organized political movements. The family could not control the narrative. Their attempts to do so, through cultural philanthropy, through political relationships, through careful management of their public image, were insufficient against the scale of what was being deployed against them. The same visibility that had made them powerful was making them vulnerable in a completely different register. And then came the political earthquakes that made the geography of the network obsolete. The First World War destroyed the concert of Europe permanently, shattered the aristocratic international order that the Rothschilds had been built to serve, and replaced the landscape of states the family had navigated for a century with a new map drawn on different principles. The five houses had been calibrated for a specific configuration of European power. That configuration no longer existed when the guns stopped in 1918. The German and Austrian houses, the houses that operated in what had been the most sophisticated financial centers of continental Europe, were caught between the collapse of the old order and the catastrophic new one. The Frankfurt House, the original house, the house Mayor Amschel had built from a coin shop above a red shield on Judengasse, had already ceased to exist in 1901 when the last Frankfurt Rothschild died without a male heir to continue the partnership. The Vienna House survived the First World War in diminished form, navigating the transformation of the Habsburg Empire into the Austrian Republic, a political change that eliminated most of the relationships that had made the Vienna House central to continental finance. Then came 1938. Louis de Rothschild, the last head of the Vienna House, was arrested at Vienna's Espion Airport on the night of March 12, 1938, the night of the Anschluss, as German troops crossed into Austria. He had delayed his departure by one day too many, staying to manage what could be managed of the family's affairs as the political situation deteriorated. He was held in Vienna for 14 months. The Austrian holdings that the family had accumulated over more than a century, the Kreditanstalt Bank, the Vitkovice Steel Works in Czechoslovakia, the agricultural estates, the Vienna Palace, the art collection that represented a century of Rothschild patronage and acquisition, all of it was used as leverage. The Nazi government wanted the Vitkovice works, which were strategically valuable for armaments production. They had Louis. They negotiated accordingly. Louis was eventually released in 1939. The Vitkovice works were sold at a price that reflected the coercive conditions of the negotiation rather than any market valuation. The palace was confiscated. The art collection, paintings and sculptures that the family had collected with the same methodical attention to quality that Mayer had brought to rare coins, was seized, catalogued by Nazi functionaries with bureaucratic thoroughness, and dispersed into collections across Europe and beyond. The human cost was specific, not abstract. It was Louis at the airport, calculating how much more time he had. It was his family's staff, their employees, their dependents, the people whose livelihoods had been built around institutions that no longer existed. It was the families of lesser-known Rothschild relatives who did not have the resources or the connections or the sheer negotiating value of the main line, who faced what the main line faced, minus the international attention and the diplomatic leverage that Louis's name provided. The security architecture Mayer had built was designed against financial threats, hostile acquisitions, disloyal heirs, industrial espionage, the kind of competitive threat that another banking family or a hostile government might mount in peacetime. It had not been designed against a state that decided to simply seize everything through violence and hold a family member hostage to enforce the transaction. The gate of Judengasse, which Mayer had spent his life learning to outsmart, had reopened in a different city, in a different century, built not of iron but of ideology, and there was no coin collection clever enough, no relationship well-maintained enough to negotiate with what it represented. The French and English houses survived. Nathan's descendants in London, James's descendants in Paris, they continued. The London house, N.M. Rothschild and Sons, operates to this day, privately held, still family-owned, still one of the more significant players in certain areas of international finance. But the five-house coordinated network, the organism that Mayer had designed, that functioned for the better part of a century as a private central bank for a continent, never reassembled. The world it had been built to serve did not survive, and the family that remained, the branches that continued in London and Paris, operated in an environment so different from the one the founding generation had navigated that they were, in a real sense, a different institution. What did the dynasty actually win? This is the question that remains after the history is over. They accumulated the largest private fortune in the world at their absolute peak. They shaped the financial architecture of European civilization. They financed the infrastructure of the industrial age. They demonstrated a model of coordinated family enterprise that would not find its equivalent again until the rise of the major American investment banks in the 20th century. They proved that a family excluded from the official structures of power could build, through financial indispensability, a form of leverage that exceeded those structures. And the human beings inside that dynasty, the children who were born into it, who had no say in the marriage rules or the inheritance architecture, or the particular role they were assigned in the corporation's deployment strategy, they paid costs they had not consented to pay. Some of them thrived. The records suggest that many of the Rothschild women, in particular, chafed against a world organized around the assumption that their primary function was to keep the capital in the family. Some of the men placed in positions they were temperamentally unsuited for performed poorly under the pressure of expectations built for a different kind of person. The corporation required its human components to serve its survival. It was efficient. It was not, in the way that the word is used when we're talking about human beings rather than organizations, kind. The modern world carries the Rothschild fingerprints in places that have become so familiar, we no longer see them as marks left by specific decisions made by specific people. The sovereign debt market, the mechanism by which governments borrow money from private creditors through bond issuances that are then traded on public markets, is the direct descendant of the mechanisms the Rothschild houses pioneered in the 1810s and 1820s. The practices they developed for rating and pricing sovereign credit, for syndicating large bond issuances across multiple markets, for using political intelligence to time sovereign debt transactions. Those practices were formalized and institutionalized by the financial industry over the following century, and they constitute the operating system through which every government on earth funds its activities today. When your government runs a deficit, the mechanism by which it covers that deficit is a direct institutional descendant of what the Rothschilds built. The Suez Canal Purchase of 1875 set in motion a chain of consequences that included the British military occupation of Egypt in 1882, the centrality of the canal to British imperial strategy throughout the 20th century, the Suez Crisis of 1956, in which Britain's attempt to reassert control over the canal after Nasser's nationalization ended in humiliation and marked, for most historians, the definitive end of British imperial power. And through that moment, shaped the specific configuration of American and Soviet power in the Middle East that structured the Cold War politics of the region. A bowl of grapes in a London office, the geopolitics of the next century. And the restitution battles over the artworks and properties seized by the Nazi government are still not fully resolved. The paintings that passed from Rothschild walls to museum walls to private collections, their provenance tracked through archives that took decades to declassify and decades more to fully analyze. Those battles have reshaped international law around cultural property, around the obligations of institutions to investigate the provenance of their collections, around the definition of what Nazi theft actually encompassed and who is responsible for rectifying it. The last act of the Rothschild drama is still being written in courts and museums. The House of Rothschild didn't build a banking empire. They built an information network that ran on human beings, on the coordination of 5 brothers in 5 capitals, on private couriers moving faster than any government post, on a marriage strategy that kept the secrets inside the family at the cost of the flexibility that might have saved it. They held that network together for the better part of a century. They used it to reshape the financial architecture of Western civilization. And then the civilization they had been built to serve consumed them, consumed the German and Austrian houses entirely, diminished the others, leaving behind institutions and financial mechanisms and legal precedents and geopolitical consequences that remained embedded in the world long after the dynasty itself had been reduced to its surviving fragments. And if you look at how your government borrows money today, at the bond markets, at the sovereign debt auctions, at the credit ratings, at the private banks that underwrite public finance, you can still see their fingerprints on every single transaction. There is one more thing that needs to be said about what the Rothschilds built, and it is the thing that tends to get lost between the mythology and the counter-mythology. The mythology says they were a shadowy cabal running the world from behind the scenes, pulling strings that governments danced on, engineering wars for profit, operating with an agenda that transcended ordinary financial motives. The counter-mythology says they were simply a successful banking family, nothing more or less, whose outsized reputation was a product of anti-Semitic fantasy given the respectable clothing of financial history. Both versions miss the thing that is actually interesting. What Mayer Amschel Rothschild built was a proof of concept for a specific kind of power that derived from information, coordination, and indispensability, rather than from territory, military force, or inherited social position. In the 18th and 19th centuries, that kind of power was genuinely new. It had no name, no established framework, no intellectual tradition that could account for it. The people who encountered it and felt its effects, the kings who needed to borrow, the finance ministers who discovered that certain bond issuances wouldn't proceed without Rothschild participation, the governments that found certain financial transactions simply more expensive when the family was not involved. They understood its practical dimensions, but not its theoretical basis. It felt to them like magic, or like conspiracy, or like an invisible hand manipulating visible events. It was none of those things. It was a corporate structure, operated by human beings who made mistakes and had disagreements and got things wrong, that had achieved a temporary, specific, historically conditioned dominance in a particular domain. The dominance was real. The mechanism was comprehensible. The temporariness was inherent from the beginning, because every structural advantage exists in a specific environment, and environments change. The family understood this on some level, which was why Mayer's will was so specific about maintaining the architecture. He understood that the advantage was structural, not essential, not something the family possessed inherently, but something they had built and needed to maintain through discipline. What he did not fully understand, because no person embedded in their own moment fully understands the forces that will eventually dissolve that moment, was that the architecture he built to preserve the advantage would eventually become the primary obstacle to adapting when the advantage required a new form. The cousin marriages, the closed loop, the insistence on family control over every significant position, these were the correct answers to the problem Mayer faced in 1812. They were increasingly wrong answers to the problems the family faced in 1880 and comprehensively wrong answers to the problems they faced in 1930. But the will had been written. The culture had been established. The institutional logic had been running for 4 generations. Institutions that have survived 4 generations have developed an immune response to fundamental change. They absorb and neutralize proposals for transformation, not through bad faith, but through the accumulated weight of their own successful history. The children who grew up Rothschild in the late 19th century were born into a structure that had been designed by a man who had died 70 years before they were born, in response to conditions that no longer fully obtained, for a world that was in the middle of its most fundamental reorganization in centuries. They were competent, often brilliant, sometimes extraordinarily cultivated. The family's patronage of the arts, its support for scientific research, its philanthropic engagement with Jewish communities across Europe, reflected genuine intellectual seriousness and a sense of obligation that was not merely performative. But they were also constrained, in ways they could not always fully see, by the architecture of their own dynasty. Nathan Mayer Rothschild, standing on the floor of the Royal Exchange in 1820, had a freedom that his grandchildren lacked. He could move fast because he had built nothing yet that required protection. The paradox of dynasty is that the thing you build to ensure continuity becomes, over time, the thing that limits possibility. You build walls to protect what's inside. The walls work, and then the walls are just walls. Mayor Amschel Rothschild died in 1812, the year he completed his will, with the architecture of the greatest private financial network in history fully conceived and nearly fully deployed. He had begun in a locked lane, counting coins in a shop that smelled of old metal and dust, wearing his father's name as a shield above the door. He died in a Frankfurt counting house that handled the finances of princes. He had watched his sons establish branch offices in the financial capitals of Europe. He had seen the gates of Judengasse open. He had watched his network function through the convulsions of the Napoleonic Wars with a coordination that no other institution had matched. What he could not see, what no founder ever sees, because the skills that make a founder are not the skills that allow a founder to see the limits of what they've built, was the shape of the cage he had constructed. Not the cage of Judengasse, which the world had built around him and which he had spent his life escaping. The cage of his own creation, the closed marriage system, the inheritance rules, the corporate structure that required its human components to serve its logic rather than live their own lives. He built it from love, from strategic intelligence, from the deepest possible understanding of what his network needed to survive. He built it without understanding what it would cost the people who would be born inside it. The history of the House of Rothschild is not the history of a conspiracy. It is the history of a corporation. And like every corporation, it served the interests of the institution first and the interests of the human beings inside it second. For one extraordinary century, those two things were close enough to the same thing that the difference was invisible. Then they diverged. And the divergence, combined with the catastrophic external shocks of nationalism and fascism that the family's architecture had never been designed to absorb, produced the outcome that looked, from the outside, like a fall. It was not exactly a fall, it was a transformation. The family that remains in London, in Paris, in the branches that spread across the 20th century as the closed marriage rules gradually relaxed and the institutional form evolved, is not the same organism that Mayer designed. It could not be, but it carries something forward: the name, the tradition, the institutional knowledge. The memory, imperfect and contested, of what it meant to have built something so precisely calibrated to its historical moment that it dominated that moment completely, and then survived the moment's passing in diminished but recognizable form. The House of Rothschild didn't build a banking empire. They built an information network that ran on human beings, held together by marriage contracts, and lasted just long enough to reshape the financial architecture of Western civilization before the civilization it had been built to serve consumed it. And if you look at how governments borrow money today, the bond markets, the sovereign debt auctions, the credit ratings, the private banks that underwrite public finance, you can still see their fingerprints on every transaction. Consider for a moment what it actually means to finance both sides of a conflict, not in the abstract, in the specific. In the 1820s, the Rothschild houses were simultaneously engaged in managing French government debt, in underwriting Austrian sovereign bonds, in providing financial services to the Prussian state. These were not friendly states. They were rivals, competitors, states with histories of warfare with each other that stretched back centuries, and would continue after the particular moment of the concert of Europe's false peace. The fact that the Rothschilds could serve all of them without being seen as treasonous by any of them, without any single government concluding that the family's service to a rival negated its usefulness, required a form of institutional neutrality that had no real precedent in the world of 18th century finance. Every other significant financial operator was embedded in a specific national context. The Rothschilds were embedded in the international one. And that embedding, that refusal to take a side that was more than tactical, was itself the product of the Judengasse experience. You could not be loyal to a state that would not acknowledge you as fully belonging to it. And so you became loyal to the mechanism of capital movement itself, which cared nothing for nationality and everything for reliability. The reliability was the product of something else that is worth naming. Mayer had built his reputation on a single transaction, the maintenance of Wilhelm's fortune through the French occupation of Frankfurt, that demonstrated, in the most concrete terms imaginable, that the Rothschild firm would honor its commitments under conditions that would have given every other firm in Europe a legitimate excuse to walk away. That reputation, once established, was worth more than any single balance sheet figure. It was the foundation on which every subsequent relationship was built. Every sovereign who dealt with the Rothschilds in the decades after Frankfurt was, on some level, dealing with the story of Wilhelm's money. The story said, "These people will hold what you give them. They will pay you what they promised. They will not use a war or a political upheaval as an excuse to renegotiate terms that were inconvenient for them." In a world where sovereign debt was perpetually at risk of default, where governments routinely used political crisis as justification for adjusting their financial obligations, that reliability was not merely commercially valuable. It was transformative. It meant that the Rothschilds could charge less, because their reliability was itself a form of risk reduction that made their bonds more valuable, while actually earning more, because their volume was so much larger than any competitors. The cheaper rates they offered on sovereign debt were not a sacrifice. They were a market penetration strategy. The sovereigns who borrowed at lower rates from the Rothschilds became dependent on that access, and dependency is leverage. The family that kept its promises became the family that governments could not afford to lose. Nathan Mayer Rothschild expressed this principle once with a directness that startled the person he was speaking to. He did not believe, he said, in keeping money. He believed in moving it. Money at rest was money losing value. Money in motion, moving across borders, moving between hands, moving from lender to borrower and back again in a continuous cycle, was money creating value. And the person who controlled the motion was the person who controlled the value. The insight was simple. The infrastructure required to execute on it, across 5 countries in 5 decades, was not. The world that the Rothschilds built, the world of coordinated international high finance, of private intelligence networks operating alongside official diplomatic channels, of families that functioned as institutional actors rather than merely private individuals, did not disappear when the family's particular dominance ended. It transformed. The practices and structures they pioneered were absorbed into the institutional architecture of global finance, formalized, expanded, made more complex and more transparent, and eventually regulated. The descendants of their operating methods sit inside every major investment bank, every sovereign wealth fund, every central bank that manages its currency against a basket of other currencies, while collecting intelligence on how other central banks are planning to move. The family is one thing. The system they helped build is something much larger and much more persistent, which is perhaps the final irony of the Rothschild story, and the one that Mayer, sitting in his counting house on Judengasse, reading his son's letters by candlelight, calculating returns on instruments that no simple description could capture, might have appreciated most. He built the network to make the family indispensable. The network worked so well that it eventually became the architecture of a financial system that no longer needed the family to function. They built their own obsolescence into the success of what they built. The contribution outlasted the contributors. The machine kept running after the machinists were gone. In the end, that is what power looks like when it has been genuinely achieved. Not the ability to remain dominant forever, but the ability to have shaped the system so thoroughly that the system continues on your terms long after your moment of dominance has passed. The Rothschilds are no longer the most powerful private financial family in the world. That position, if it exists at all in its old form, belongs to different institutions in different configurations. But the sovereign bond markets in which every government on earth currently operates, the rating agencies, the underwriting practices, the international capital flows, these are the monuments the family built. Not the palaces, not the art collections, not the name above the door. The mechanism of how governments borrow money, and the assumption embedded in that mechanism that private creditors will be repaid even when doing so, is politically inconvenient for the borrowing government. That is the Rothschild monument, and it is one that nobody is going to tear down.